Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for episode 21 of Bullish. Remember, anything that we discuss is not individual investment advice. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Stenger Family Office and its clients may hold positions in some of the stocks discussed. For a full disclosure, visit stengerfamilyoffice.com. I'm Sam Hardy. Nick Stenger's joining us from Houston. We've got Producer O. As always, we are Stenger Family Office. For the past 43 years, it has been our mission to deliver clarity and confidence to help secure your financial future. If you haven't subscribed to the show, be sure to do that. Please like and share it to get the clarity and the confidence out there. Today's show is going to be, especially timely. We're going to go deep into politics. Of course, we're going to talk about the elections, its implications on the markets. And to do that, we have Bob Stein, an industry expert, joining us from First Trust. So, Bob, just want to say thanks for joining us on Bullish.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for being here. I have heard you speak at a number of First Trust events throughout the years, and you always give people a data-based view on what you think is coming. You've pretty much been spot on over the years as we've followed you. So big debate tomorrow night. We're going to release the show first thing in the morning on Tuesday morning. What's going to happen in the debate once people watch the show?
So here's the deal. I've gone back over not this year's debate where Trump basically scored a TKO over Biden, which is kind of rare in general election history, obviously, or unique in general election history. I've looked at the other 5 debates, general election debates that Donald Trump's been involved with, the 3 versus Hillary Clinton and the 2 versus Joe Biden back in 2020. And the 3 versus Hillary Clinton, none of those debates were massive needle movers. The first 2 debates, Clinton rose in the polls relative to Trump by 1 percentage point each time. And then the third debate, Donald Trump rose in the polls by 1 percentage point. And then in 2020, Donald Trump made a complete ass out of himself in the first debate. And by the way, I think your clients will know that at First Trust, we just tell you what we think. Okay, so don't worry, ass will be the worst word I use today. So I hope that's kosher. Okay, so he was a complete bore during the first debate with Biden constantly interrupting him and needlessly and stupidly interrupting him when he should have just let Biden speak for himself. and he fell by 3 points relative to Biden at that first debate. Second debate, he actually picked up a 0.5 percentage point after the second debate in the week that followed. So out of those 5 debates, the only one that moved the needle in a huge way was the first debate with Biden in 2020, where he made a complete jerk out of himself. So assuming Trump doesn't come off as a complete and utter bore like he did that time 4 years ago, he'll be okay. Right now, Harris is up in the polls by about 1.5 percentage points. Frankly, at this point, she should be up by about 4 percentage points for it to be a toss-up. So she's behind the 8 ball or behind the curve a little bit. And I give Trump an edge. So she's got to really deliver a clear message to the voters in a positive and likable way. I think when voters look at the debates, they're kind of looking at the debates in terms of, like, who do I want to invite in my home over the next 4 years? Who's more entertaining? And so I think Harris has to show that she's interesting, entertaining, and intelligent. And she really needs to pick up a lot of support over the next few weeks. So I'm not sure she's going to do it. And frankly, if Donald Trump does decently well, just holds her to par in this debate, then if I were Trump, I would turn around after the debate and say, listen, I've already done 2 debates on your networks. You need to do at least 1 debate on mine. So if the next debate isn't on Fox, count me out. It's got to be on Fox or nothing for you guys.
So, Bob, the sneak attack of Kamala Harris coming in, how did we end up here? How did they not have an open primary? Are there rules behind this that we're just not aware of? Or was this really a deep state operation?
Now, I don't see it as a deep state operation, because if it were a deep state operation, then Donald Trump was cooperating, which would have been stupid of him. Like, he should have just refused to debate Joe Biden until September. or until well after he were nominated. And at that point, a lot of the ballots are printed in many states, and it would have been too late for the Democrats to do what I think they did, which was like the pull the goalie strategy in hockey. You know, you pull the goalie late in the game when you're behind, and you have a better chance of winning. You also have a better chance of losing by more, but you're desperate. Okay. So a deep state operation would have required the cooperation of Donald Trump himself, which just is ridiculous. What happened is everybody on the Democratic side was so on board with this whole story that no, Joe Biden doesn't have mid-stage dementia. He's perfectly fine. This is the best Biden ever. Trump thought he would just beat up on Biden and Biden would stay in the race, but they pulled a fast one and pulled him. It's really that Biden voluntarily withdrew, but it was basically Nancy Pelosi sticking a knife in his back. My interpretation, it wasn't the 25th Amendment. I don't buy that interpretation because I don't think the Harris political team is effective enough to go around to all the cabinet members and not have it disclosed during the course of that. So here's what happened. My interpretation is that Nancy Pelosi went to her friends in Hollywood and her friends in Silicon Valley and said, no more donations to Biden. And then she went to Biden and said, hey, your donations are drying up. Maybe you should consider dropping out. And then Adam Schiff and all these other Democrats said, well, we're not going to, we think Biden should drop out. And when people say you should drop out, they're not going to speak at the convention. And so Pelosi's saying, hey, who do you have left to speak at the convention? Bernie Sanders, AOC, and all the other flame-throwing nutcases on the left wing of the Democratic Party. So his donations were drying up, and they were even telling him, these people aren't even going to give you money for your presidential library if you leave office. So you're going to lose, you're going to look ridiculous, and then you're not going to have a place to put your comic books. So, okay, that was a cheap shot, but I would have done it for the other side too. So basically, like Pelosi, I think, arranged the whole thing. And I think Obama was supportive, but it was really Pelosi behind the scenes that arranged everything. Those presidential libraries don't come at taxpayer expense. They have to have big money billionaire donors. That's what they do. And those people were saying, we're not even going to donate to your library unless you leave the race. And so he left, but he made sure he endorsed Harris, which is why the 25th Amendment story about Harris going around trying to get the cabinet members to oust him doesn't make sense. Because if it were Harris, there's no way Biden would have endorsed her. He would have endorsed an open process instead. But it really kind of also undermined this whole issue about this campaign's about democracy. Well, if it's about democracy, how many people voted for Kamala Harris to be the Democrats' nominee? Grand total of 0. So that kind of argument flies out the window too.
So assuming they would have had an open primary and gone through the democratic process, who do you think the top candidates would have been? Would it have been a Michelle Obama? Would it have been Gavin Newsom, some of the household names, or what would you expect other than Kamala Harris?
I think the ticket that would have emerged is something like Gretchen Whitmer with Mark Kelly from Arizona, or Gretchen Whitmer or Ralph Warnock, actually, is more likely, from Georgia, because if it were an open process, but that's just guesswork. There would have had to have been at least one minority candidate on the ticket, VP or president. So I think a Whitmer-Warnock ticket would have made a lot of sense.
So what are your thoughts on the VP picks? JD Vance on the right, and then you have Tim Walz on the left. What are your thoughts there?
Really mediocre picks on both sides. So here's what happened with Trump. I think he was so confident, in fact, overconfident after the debate. Remember, Biden hadn't withdrawn yet, that he decided to go with Vance because he thought, you know what, I can pick whomever I darn well please, because this race is pretty much wrapped up. So he ended up going with Vance, thinking he didn't need to reach out to the other side of the party like Nikki Haley or Glenn Youngkin. And he didn't need to try to expand the party with Hispanic voters with Marco Rubio. So he decided to go with Vance, which is like the mini MAGA guy. You know, it's like MAGA Junior, and doubled down on his wing of the party because he didn't think he had to reach out to anybody. So mediocre pick, not fully vetted, has only won one statewide race in his whole life, one election his whole life, and has yet to prove that he's even an above par pick for the state of Ohio. He's kind of like Elizabeth Warren always wins Massachusetts, right? But she actually wins Massachusetts by less than other Democrats would. So she's actually a below par pick for the Democrats. She's never shown a sign that she's a really good politician. Okay. Well, Vance is the same for Ohio. He's yet to show that he can pull above his weight for a Republican in the leading Republican state of Ohio. So I think he's a par pick, not a horrible pick, not a great pick either. Tim Walz, same thing. I mean, Harris definitely should have picked Joshua Shapiro in the state of Pennsylvania. That could have tilted a key electoral state, perhaps the key electoral state, in her direction. Instead, she doubled down on her left-wing part of the party with Tim Walz. I mean, the funny thing about Walz, like, this is a little bit of a dated reference, obviously. He looks like Archie Bunker, but he has the opinions of Meathead. Okay, so it's kind of a weird thing. So she doubled down on the left-wing side of her party. Minnesota is not a swing state, so mediocre pick as well. Not a disaster, but not a good pick either.
What are your thoughts on the China influence in our politics today and what you're seeing? Even I think it was Hochul's campaign had a Chinese spy working for the campaign, which is kind of a shocker. You know, where are we going with all this Chinese influence? You're seeing it all over the globe, but especially now in the U.S. Is that a real factor that's underneath the surface?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, the Chinese made a very effective use of their money in the very early 1990s when they supported Bill Clinton's initial presidential campaign and gubernatorial campaigns before that through the Riotti family, which had a little bit of a base in Arkansas. And at that point in time, America kind of saw that as benign. And a lot of people saw that as benign because, okay, they were supporting Bill Clinton, and I'm sure they supported many Republicans as well, but they really supported Bill Clinton because there was a strong protectionist wing. Back, 30 years ago, the protectionists tended to be Democrats, not Republicans. And they supported Clinton because he was the free trader on the Democratic side. And so a lot of other Americans were like, yeah, they're just supporting him because they want to make sure the Democrats don't go full hog protectionist. And they needed to make sure the Democrats, if they elected a president, were not going to force not move the U.S. into a protectionist or anti-Tiananmen Square, if you will, direction. And so they got a free trader out of Bill Clinton. They got a free trader with GATT. They got a free trader with moving toward China ascension to the World Trade Organization and most favored nation status with the U.S. So that's what they got out of Clinton. They got their money's worth. And then when the Republicans got elected with George Bush, the younger, in 2000, well, they didn't have to give the Republicans money because the Republicans were already free traders at that point in time. And so basically, even with Obama, like, Chinese liked Obama because he was on the free trade wing of the Democratic Party at the time, kind of representing the upscale social liberals that had become increasingly powerful on the Democratic side. So, yeah, I mean, their position is basically to neutralize the U.S. vis-a-vis Taiwan and to bolster the free trade wing of the Democratic Party, and also to have the Democratic Party look past the, China is responsible for COVID. It's either it came from the wet market, okay, or it came from the Wuhan lab. It's one or the other. Now, I tend to be on the Wuhan lab side, but I'm not 100% by any stretch, okay? But one or the other. So why are we free trading with China? I mean, it's really beyond me. So I think what their donations give them politically is is the preservation of a favorable trade status vis-a-vis the United States.
Bob, you mentioned that Kamala is up in the polls right now on the national level, but what are the states to watch? Obviously, a couple new states have fallen into the purple category or the swing state category. What's your breakdown right now on what's going on a state level?
So here's the deal. She's up by about 1.5 percentage point in the polling averages. She needs to be up at this point by around 4 points in the polling averages. And there are two reasons for actually three. Number one, because she's still coming off the glow of the Democratic National Convention, which ran favorably for her. Number two, because Trump will probably poll better in the actual, or do better in the actual election than he'll do in the polls. And number three, Trump probably has maybe a 2.5 percentage point advantage in the Electoral College relative to the popular vote. And so Harris has to be up in the polls by more than she currently is. She's not. 1.5 ain't 3.5 or 4. So I make Trump the favorite. The 6 states that really will determine, 6 or 7 that really will determine this election, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Trump doesn't have to win all of them. He probably has to win 5 of them, 4 or 5 of them to win. He might be able to lose Nevada if he takes Pennsylvania or Michigan instead. My best guess is that he's going to win 6 or 7 of those states. Okay, so I'm right now. Okay, so I think he's the favorite. I think he has about a 60% chance of winning, maybe slightly more, slightly more. I might change my view after tomorrow night's debate, but I'm going to wait for the initial polling after the debate. And I will not pay any attention to those polls of people who won the debate, because that's just a poll of who did you support going into the debate. What I want to see is there a shift strongly in her direction in the week following the polls? What week following the debate? That's what I want to see.
Well, we're going to see that tonight when this episode comes out, and we'll see just what those policies are. I mean, she hasn't really had to talk about policy yet in the media. She hasn't had to do a press conference. So what's your expectation for policy? Is she going to start to move towards the middle? Is she as radical as people think? She could alienate the ultra left wing of the party. So where is she going to fall on policy here?
So personally, I think she is very left wing. I think she's another, this is a little dated reference, but President Obama was the first Henry Wallace Democrat to be elected president. Our previous Democratic presidents were more traditionally liberal, more FDR Democrats, if you will, whether they be Johnson or Carter or Clinton. Obama was a different flavor, and I think Harris would be that flavor as well. But she's a little light on the ability to explain policies relative to President Obama, who's a very smart guy. So I think she wants to keep things vague and talk about the future and making it better. But she's going to be a little light on policy. Now, that said, if Harris wins, the Senate is likely to be 50-50. I'm sorry, if Harris wins, she's likely to face off against the GOP Senate, which immediately ends her hopes of enacting anything far left, at least in terms of legislation. Even if there's a Democratic sweep, it's likely to be a 50-50 Senate. And in a 50-50 Senate, Mark Kelly from Arizona, John Tester from Montana are not going to sign on to anything super radical. So this whole fear about taxing unrealized gains, raising the capital gains tax to 40% plus, that ain't going to happen even if the Democrats sweep, because they're not going to have the ability to keep every Democrat in line for a vote like that.
So you're saying we are not going to be unburdened by what has been?
Essentially so. What has been will play a role in the future, whether the politician at the top likes it or not.
Well, and we joke about that phrase, you know, being unburdened by what has been, but if you actually look that up, the roots of that, I mean, it like is straight up Marxism, isn't it?
Well, you know, I haven't looked up the roots, so I can't give you the etymology of the phrase.
Bob, how is she going to explain though, hey, we're going to change what's going on. We're going to make things better. And then all the voters out there are going to probably say, wait a second, you've been in there for 3.5 years. If you wanted to change something, why didn't you do it already? How does she explain her way out of that one? I mean, if I were Trump, that'd be my biggest thing I'd hit her on.
That's exactly right, and I expect them to do so. Yeah, hard explanation for the incumbent party to talk about the future and why they didn't do things over the past 3.5 years.
So let's assume the different scenarios happen. She wins. Maybe you get divided government. What do you think markets end up doing in a variety of scenarios here?
I think the market would be okay initially with a Trump win or a Harris win where there's divided government, because then there can't be any radical tax legislation coming up. And I think in the end, the markets would correctly expect that the tax cut would be mostly extended. Here's the problem with Harris on top, but divided government. I don't think there's any deficit reduction whatsoever, because most of the tax cut would be extended, because Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, green energy subsidies are not pared back. So that's a recipe for $2.5 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see. So I think eventually the markets would grasp that. And I think the bond market vigilantes would not like it, not one little bit.
Is that why a lot of this hasn't gotten priced in yet? Because you would expect if you thought Democrats were going to sweep in a couple months here, wouldn't the market be down like 20 or 30% in anticipation?
I don't think so, because I think the market would correctly anticipate that that a 50-50 Senate would not lead to radical changes on taxes.
Do you think that the bond market is mispriced right now? And do you see inflation as a continued risk in any of the scenarios?
Okay. I think a decade ahead, no matter who gets elected, the decade ahead is going to have higher average inflation than the decade pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, it was 1.5%. I think the decade to come is going to be 2.5%. However, okay, I'm an economist, so I get to speak out of both sides of my mouth on occasion. It's professional courtesy. Okay. So what I think is going to happen, given that monetary policy is already tight and inflation's already come down a lot, and it takes time for a shift in monetary policy to actually have an influence on the direction of inflation. And even when we start cutting rates next week, that doesn't make monetary policy loose. It just means less tight. I actually think that temporarily in the first half of next year, inflation is going to be at or below the Fed's 2% target. I can't emphasize temporarily enough. Eventually, it's going to come back up because they're going to over-loosen eventually. Again, decade ahead, 2.5% inflation, not 1.5%. But early next year, I think the bond market is going to be quite pleased with the position of inflation 6 to 9 months from now.
Do you think Powell ends up as the next Burns, or is he going to be like Volcker and be pretty tough on inflation for the long run?
Well, he's only got a couple of years left. So I think he'll be quite happy a year from now. But that, basically the swing back up in inflation will be a burden to the next Fed chairman. If Harris wins, it'd be Lyle Brainerd, who's already been at the Fed for quite some time. And if Trump wins, my best guess is he ends up appointing Kevin Warsh, who is a former Fed official originally appointed by George W. Bush.
So what if you had to grade Powell A, B, C, or D on his performance, what would you give him?
I don't grade because it means different things to different people. I just can't do that. If I say a B minus, it just means different things to different people. I don't like to speak in terms in vague generalities where people can impute their own definitions to them. I speak in actual numbers.
Yeah, well, it seems like a lot of people think we were in a soft landing. Would you agree with that, or would you say there's worse things to come?
So far, but I think there's some turbulence to come, because I think the increase in the deficit over the past couple of years has masked temporarily some of the pain we'll eventually feel from the tightening of monetary policy over the past couple of years.
You think we're headed to recession next 6 to 9 months?
I think it's like 50-50. So, it's not baked in the cake. It's not for sure. And I would say 6 to 12 months for it to start. but I think the odds of a recession are higher than the markets are currently pricing in.
The other day, the person who was spot on and said inflation was transitory, and now she's saying that everything's just fine. Is that like the Jim Cramer trade where you just do the opposite of whatever they say?
I don't know. Yeah, it depends. It depends on your timing. I wouldn't be too obsessed with the short-term variations in inflation. Because the question for most investors is, where are we going to be a decade from now? Where are we going to be 30 years from now? So if the stuff going on 10 years, over the next 6 to 9 months is relevant for 10 or 30 years from now, yeah, you should trade it. Otherwise, just ignore it.
So, Bob, last question for you, just a softball to wrap things up today.
I love softballs, by the way.
Who killed Kennedy, and did we really land on the moon?
I love this. So here's the deal. Okay, this is my personal opinion. I believe Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots, acted alone, and got lucky. He had a ledge to place the long edge of his rifle on, which made him a better shot than usual. Like if you've shot rifles, like the problem is the edge, but he had a ledge. He missed with the first shot. He trained his sights. He got lucky the next 2 shots. That's it. And this car being driven slowed down after the first shot, which enabled him to improve his aim. I do not think there was anybody in the grassy knoll. And for there to be a conspiracy, and this is true for both the JFK assassination. I'm assuming you're talking about JFK, not RFK. For this to be true, like for there to be a conspiracy with the JFK assassination, I mean, think about it. JFK himself was the one who decided not to put the roof on the car that day. Himself. Was he in on it? That's ridiculous. No. Okay. So, and then the other one for the moon landing. Think about how many hundreds of people would have had. I know people who believe it was fake. Okay. So I take this seriously. Think about how they always want to walk me through the physics of it. And I'm like, well, I'm not a physicist. So how can I judge? I go, are you a physicist? And they always say, no, I'm actually not. I'm like, well, then how can you judge the physics of it? So here's the deal. For the hundreds of people who would have had to have been involved, why haven't any of them in the past 55 years come forward and say, hey, we faked it? Like none of them. Nobody who's ever said it's been faked was actually associated with a program and heavily involved. Like, think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that they could get in book deals and movies if they just come forward and said, no, I was involved in faking it. But no one ever did. Why? Because it wasn't faked. Okay. You have to think about this in terms, like, rather than trying to pretend you're a scientist and understand it. Okay. Just think of in terms of something called Bayesian reasoning. Okay. If it were faked, why hasn't anybody come forward? If it were a conspiracy, you're telling me none of the Irish FBI and Secret Service agents within the following 10 years ever went to a bar and spouted that they were involved in the conspiracy? Come on. My wife's Irish, so half my family's Irish. There's a little bit of drinking. No one came forward and said, hey, XYZ, and I was involved. Please.
Well, Buzz Aldrin did say there might be aliens on Mars. So just putting that out there. Bob, last question for you. And
wait, I thought the last question was the last.
One last question. The show is called Bullish. For all of our clients who are listening, are you still bullish long-term on the U.S. economy?
Very long-term, absolutely. Here's the deal. I know people are down about the long-term direction of the U.S. sometimes. When the Roman Empire peaked and went into decline, they still had 400 good years. Okay, so even if the U.S. is in a very, very, very long-term decline, it's not necessarily an investable decision over your lifetime or even your grandkids' lifetimes. If you were to come from outer space in human form and had to live in one country for the rest of your life, where would it be? China? India? Come on. You pick the USA over any other country in the world.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bob.
My pleasure.